Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. It's 3 o'clock. Welcome to our third in a series of the justice events of this year. It's not on? Okay. And I just said welcome, Joanne. All right. And this is the third in our series that are connected all to justice in one way or another. 2 weeks from today, October 25th, Dr. Grant and his a friend, an associate, a Dominican associate, will speak on at the last event on the racial divide, and that should be very promising and good too, like all the rest have been and will be. I'd like to begin today with a short prayer to our loving God, who has a special place in his heart, I think, for women. Dear God, creator of women in your own image, born of a woman in the midst of a world half women, carried by women to the mission fields around the globe, made known by women to all the children of the earth, give to the women of our time the strength to persevere, the courage to speak out, the faith to believe in you beyond systems and institutions, so that your face on earth may be seen in all its beauty, and so that men and women become whole, and so that the whole world may be converted to your will in everything and in all ways. We call on the holy women who went before us, channels of your word, in testaments old and new, to intercede for us, so that we might all be given the grace to become what they have been, for the honor and glory of God. Amen. Amen. Today, women in society, are standing tall and taller, and are playing a much bigger role in our world, and have gained lots of ground in politics, in the workplace, and even in our own households. Here to talk with you about the journey of this growth are these four wonderful women of our own university. The title of their combined presentation is Women, the Heartbeat of Society. And just briefly, I want to introduce you to each one. Dr. Imali Abala is a professor of English at Ohio Dominican University. She teaches a variety of courses in English, including first-year college writing and literature courses on diversity, African American, world, and women. She also teaches courses online as part of the MA program, MA in the English program. She has been writing about women's struggle to find their voice in Kenya for over 2 decades, specifically in these pieces, The Dreamer, The Dilemma of Jahenda, The Teenage Mother, and Move On, Trufosa. Dr. Virginia McCormack, next to her, is the Professor of Education. She works with diverse students in all of the education programs, particularly in reading and methods and graduate education. She is a certified, licensed P-12 classroom teacher and administrator. Welcome, Jenny. Dr. Kelsey Squire, Dr. Anjel Stough-Hunter is assistant professor of sociology, started as an adjunct at Ohio Dominican University in 2011. She teaches a number of sociology courses and core courses, including women's issues. As a rural sociologist, she is interested in how place, especially rural communities, matter in understanding issues of gender and health and the environment. And she had her little daughter here, but she disappeared. little Piper wanted to hear her. Dr. Kelsey Squire is an associate professor of English at Ohio Dominican University. She teaches courses in first-year writing and American literature. She also teaches courses online as part of the MA English program. In both her classes and her research, she examines the representation of women in literature and the experiences of women writers. Welcome to all of you. Okay, let's begin.
Thank you, Sister Diane. It's an honor to be here and part of the Center for Dominican Studies Justice events. Our justice journey began with Dr. Carson's perspectives on global poverty and continued with Dr. Hart's Justice for Immigrants panel. As we shift our focus to exploring the issues of social justice as it relates to women, we reiterate Dr. Carson's definition of justice, that justice is a right relationship we have with ourselves, others, and God. Absent of these relationships, justice fails. To this end, we approach our topic from 4 different perspectives: global, cultural norms, MAME; historical, equal pay and just wage; current, Me Too movement; media and the arts, sharing women's stories. We're invested in examining how social and cultural norms can perpetuate injustice in women's lives or facilitate justice.
So for my part in this presentation, I'm going to be looking at women issues from a global sense, but I'm actually going to be focusing more on Kenya because that's what I know and that's what I have experienced. So I begin by actually making an argument that gender inequality in Kenya is well documented and an ongoing issue. In fact, during the first UN World Conference on Women held in Mexico in 1975, the country was cited for its violation of women's rights. Some of the general concerns for which it came under fire were twofold: female circumcision, which was aimed at controlling women's sexuality, and the high illiteracy rate among women, which paralyzed them from functioning fully in a changing landscape. As a result, the government, under the leadership of Jomo Kenyatta, began the initiative to right these wrongs, first by paying lip service to the female circumcision question, and secondly, implementing a series of campaigns aimed at improving the literacy rate of women. Some of the illiteracy campaigns were undertaken as early as in 1967, 1972, but peaked in 1978 and 79, with women being the majority attendee. However, these very initiatives were dealt a death blow in the late 80s, shortly following the 3rd UN World Conference on Women held in Nairobi, Kenya in 1985. Men started to complain vigorously that women were neglecting their natural responsibilities to the home by wasting their precious time attending literacy classes. As a result, in some areas, the program was completely scrapped and the women were back to square one with limited to no possibilities of becoming literate. Now, during the 4th United Nations Conference on Women, held on September 5th, 1995 in Beijing, China, Hillary Clinton, in her speech, proclaimed that women's rights are human rights. This conference sought to build on the progress made in earlier conferences held in Mexico in 1975, Copenhagen in 1980, in Nairobi in 1985. All these conferences aimed at securing equality for women with men in law and in practice. Clinton's words, though expressed over 2 decades ago, still resonate today. Most women worldwide, in every facet of their daily lives, face gender-based discrimination and sexism, which is why we are here at this table today talking about women. However, for the purpose of my presentation on justice, I will only focus on Kenyan women and by extension African women who have and still to this day bear the brand of sexism and discrimination. Their nominal status in society is grounded in cultural norms that unjustly marginalize them, denying them their human rights. To get to the core of this, I'll draw my examples from the Logori ethnicity of Western Kenya, partly because women from this region have not to this day cashed in on dividends that men so freely enjoy in a post-colonial Kenya. Secondly, while it's easy to actually claim that women's inequality concerns in Kenya are embedded in the cultural norms of the country, that the colonial legacy, which planted a seed of privileging a male child's education over the girl, magnified the gender gap. Family oftentimes terminated a girl's education because they deemed it unnecessary for her being. This issue is not unique to Kenya alone, but occurred and still occur in many other African regions. And I cite an example from a writer who is from Zimbabwe by the name Tsitsi Ndengaremba, whose seminal work titled Nervous Conditions shocked the world when her central character in her opening line, named Tambuzai, claimed, "I was not sorry when my brother died." And so for people from this region, it became a shocker to kind of assume a young girl could be so unfeeling about the death of her own brother. Now, readers later on eventually learn her reaction is actually grounded in the fact that she was denied the right to go to school, and therefore she couldn't respond to it in any other way by just claiming that she wasn't sorry. So I also highlight this particular issue in one of my recent works published last year called The Dreamer, where I look at how a young girl from Kenya struggles to this day to actually be able to be given an opportunity to have an education. So I thought it would be interesting to kind of share a few cultural norms that are practiced within Kenya to kind of let you know how it becomes kind of hard for a woman to actually be able to function in this society. And I say that just treatment for all people in any society, whether we are looking at Kenya or the United States, should always be something more paramount. And I say, however, this hasn't been always the case for women from my part of the world, because we know that women are naturally supposed to be caregivers and men are naturally supposed to be people who work outside the home. So aside from that very minor difference, we have specific norms that in a sense highlight more the differences between women and men. So I wanted to draw your attention to some of the images I have on the PowerPoint, beginning with the egg to the left. Now, within this particular society, for a very long time, women were never allowed to actually eat an egg or chicken, because eating an egg or chicken was considered a taboo, and any woman who violated that norm had to face consequences. And there were at least 3 possible consequences she could face. 1, she could be stoned to death or killed for eating chicken or an egg. Number 2, she could be ostracized from society. And number 3, she could be expelled from society altogether. So therefore, that being the case, women really didn't have a voice, didn't have a choice, and so therefore they complied to that particular practice. The second image here, which is one that focuses on dowry, and which is my second example, I'm going to read this one so I don't forget to tell you exactly what I had. For the second one, we always say that most men from this particular community do not see any problem whatsoever with the common practice where a man is required to pay a dowry before marrying his wife. The woman has no say in this transaction either, because it's decided for her by her male relatives. This erodes her individuality and in a sense transforms her into a commodity or property to be accrued by her husband. The bride price could be higher if she's still a virgin on her marriage day. These days, the level of education a girl has is factored into the transaction. then soon thereafter, she must uproot herself from her family to her husband's home, where she becomes a stranger. And here she remains voiceless in her marriage, not fully actualized until she can be able to bear children. And not just any children, but they have to be male children. Now, in the case, for example, of my mother, she had 7 daughters, and she had 2 sons. Her firstborn wasn't a boy, and so they kind of told her she was giving birth to frogs. And for the longest, we were actually referred to as the woman who had 7 frogs, okay? And that was just how the perception within the culture was when it pertained to women. Now, in the third image here, where I have the kids, then we kind of go back and say within this particular culture that a woman was defined by the number of children that she had. And again, as I said, they had to be men. But if a woman was childless, then that was justification enough for the husband to make the choice to divorce her or actually to become polygamous. In some cases, the woman could be actually asked to help the husband to choose her co-wife, and oftentimes not so much. The third option was where the woman could actually be required to be a female husband, and I'm sure you guys have never heard of that concept, where a woman can be a female husband by choosing another woman who can bear the kids for her, but she resides within the woman's home. So, and that was the only leverage she may have had in that particular relationship. So in this case then, in looking at the fact that if a woman doesn't have kids, then the man has the choice to actually have multiple wives, as I indicate there. Now, for Kenyan women, maybe as recent as 2014, it was actually a very devastating moment for all of us who are women from that particular region, where the president himself passed a very unpopular legislation which actually legalized the idea that men could actually have multiple wives. And we had one case of a man whose name was Akuku Danger, who married 100 wives and ended up having 210 children. So again, in that particular in that particular illustration, the women had no say in the matter. And so when he died, then the women ended up having to face another hurdle. Now within the culture, we have this thing which is called inheriting a woman. Okay? And the idea of being inherited, if you are a woman married to someone, really kind of perpetuates the idea that you have no voice, you are a property to a man, and therefore you can be traded at any given time. And in one of my earlier works called Move On to Fossa, I actually made that to be the central focus of my book because my aunt herself had been threatened with being inherited, and she refused and ended up running away. But when she came, the guy who wanted to inherit her ended up poisoning her. So it always ended up having more dire consequences for women, especially if they violated the norm. So with that being said, I say that the notion of being inherited in itself demeans a woman's self-worth and calls attention yet again as property, not fully human, that ought to be passed around. And many people usually say that this is our culture, so therefore there's nothing we can be able to do about it, and because it's our culture, it has to be right. So in kind of trying to wrap this up very quickly so my colleagues can be able to offer us their view, I say that for most Kenyan women, one of the important things that they have to do, or we have to do, is to actually think of how we can be able to break this cycle of where women are in a sense treated as property. So I say for the common good of our humanity, I argue that women need an education to overcome their nominal place in society, it's one of the ways of tipping the scales of social justice and equality in their favor. Most women in the West take this right for granted, but for Kenyan women, it's a gate path, if you will, for them to gain not only economic power, but also a strong sense of self and voice, individually and politically. Thus, the underlying assumption here is that if women understand their condition, know their right, learn skills traditionally denied to them, empowerment will follow. Consequently, they will become stronger and more confident, have the ability to negotiate their own decisions in matters that affect their lives, and claim their rights. These rights are not unique to women. These are human rights, as asserted by Clinton in her speech. But Kenyan women, they have not come easily for Kenyan women. And I say for years, their rights have been deferred by the powers that be, and here I'm thinking about men, and in this case, it becomes an unjust thing. And I reference David Henry Thoreau, who was a philosopher critical of American social institutions, who claimed in his famous essay, Civil Disobedience, that justice deferred is actually justice denied. And I think that most Kenyan women have been denied this right for a very long time. And I think it's not just, they deserve just and fair treatment in any, as it is in any given society under the law. Women too ought to have their fair slice. Okay. Ultimately, I kind of wanted to put this slide on here to show you that we even have an African proverb that seems to actually promote this idea that African women really do need to have an education if they want to improve their station in life. And in my last slide there, I kind of look at the idea that when we look at Kenyan cultures, women are never at the table where decisions that affect them are made. And part of the problem is they don't have a voice. They haven't had the education to be able to know that they do have a voice. And I say that if they're given a voice, they're in a position where they can be able to look at norms that don't really promote their welfare. And education will also help women become active participants in decision making as opposed to simply sitting on the sideline. They can also be able to have ownership of property, and they can also participate in community building. Finally, I say that the presence of women is also needed in matters that have to do with land, because again, for a long time, women could not be able to own land. I couldn't own land, and my father had to buy land for me in his name and transfer it to me. He couldn't just purchase land for me in my name. And so if these changes can be able to happen, or if women can be able to have an education, then I'm sure we are always going to end up in a better place. So to me, I believe that education is power. It's the only key that we need to be able to bring about changes in our lives.
So we continue with equal pay. The pay gap affects all women. Let's take a look back. An historical timeline indicates that women made up a quarter of the workforce by the early 20th century. By 1911, significant progress had been made. New York teachers were finally granted pay equal to that of their male counterparts, and after a long, contentious battle with the Board of Education. During World War I and World War II, the National Labor Board decided that women should be paid the same as men, and equal pay was championed as supporting the war efforts. In 1945, the U.S. Congress introduced the Women's Equal Pay Act, which would have made it illegal to pay women less than men for comparable quality and quantity. The measure failed to pass. And despite campaigns by women's groups, little progress was made on pay equity during the 1950s. national legislation was finally passed in 1963 when President John F. Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Law into effect, overcoming opposition from business leaders and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who were concerned that women workers would be more costly than male workers. In its final form, the Equal Pay Act mandated that employers cannot award unequal wages or benefits to women and men working jobs that require equal skill, effort, and responsibility, and which are performed under similar circumstances. Additional measures were created, such as Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, prohibiting employment discrimination, Title IX of the Educational Amendments in 1972, which provided protection against gender discrimination. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978 protected pregnant employees, and the Family and Medical Leave of 1991 allowed parents, regardless of gender, to take time off. In 2009, President Obama opted for the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act as his first piece of legislation. And this restored some protections against discrimination that had been stripped in the 2000 Supreme Court case and encouraged employers to make their pay rolls more fair. The Fair Act bill has been amended and amended and amended. From 2010 and now it's 2018, it is still not a law. The bill seeks to amend the Fair Labor Act of 1938 that prohibits discrimination in the payment of wages according to sex, race, or national origin. Considering that women make up almost half of the workforce, women continue to earn less than men on average in nearly every occupation. Let's take a moment and think about the amount of money a woman may make specifically. An Asian woman, a white woman, a black woman, Native American woman, and a Latina woman. Fix an amount that's less than $1 in your mind. Ready for the big reveal? So, research about the wage gap from the National Women's Center in 2018 indicated that for every dollar made by a man working full-time year-round, that Asian women are typically paid 85 cents, white women earned approximately 80 cents, black women normally only make 61 cents, Native American women only 58 cents, and a Latina woman merely 53 cents. So based on this national pay disparity numbers that we see before us, hypothetically, a white woman would have to keep working roughly for 15 months. A black woman would need to work 18 months, and a Native American woman would need to work 19 months in order to make the same amount of money a year as a man does. Iceland is the first country to take the fight against the gender pay gap a step further, requiring companies to proactively get equal pay certification from the government. Starbucks has reached a gender and race pay equity among all U.S. employees. These milestones are the result of years of work and commitment. Individual states are taking action. In fact, in 2017, 42 states introduced laws to address the wage gap. Their strategies range from banning salary histories to ensuring employees have vital access to salary information in order to identify if they're being paid unfairly. 5 states, California, Colorado, Delaware, Nevada, and Oregon, as well as Puerto Rico, succeeded in passing their laws. This year, 38 states have pay equity legislation under consideration, with a new law passing in the state of Washington just last month. We've witnessed 5 decades of economic progress for women, supported by the expansion of civil rights and sweeping changes in the role of women in the workplace and our national economy. Yet women still face stagnant wage gains like earlier decades, despite increases in education and workforce participation. Acknowledging that the fight for equal pay is not just about money, but about women being unfairly paid less than they are worth. In 1891, the Catholic Church recognized the plight of late 19th century workers. Pope Leo XIII issued an encyclical, a letter, Rerum Novarum, or the rights and duties of capital and labor, that spoke out about the moral challenge posed by industrialization. In 1919, the International Labor Organization stated that one of the fundamental human rights is the right to a just remuneration. That ensures an existence worthy of human dignity. Many countries globally have minimum wage legislation or a living wage bill. However, there's great disparity in the distribution of wages, and the aspiration of living wage is not fulfilled. So more than 100 years after Rerum Novarum, millions of working poor are struggling to make ends meet. So there's a growing inequality in many countries. Some people might argue that an adequate living wage is one of the conditions for universal and lasting peace based on social justice. Nearly 2/3, that would be 6 out of 10, of the minimum wage workers in the United States are women. And the minimum wage falls far short of what it takes to live above the poverty line. Too many single mothers live in poverty. Women are overrepresented in low-wage jobs despite better education credentials than ever. And unemployment rates remain painfully high for some groups of women. In every state, a woman with 2 children working full-time at a minimum wage job live near or below the poverty line. And I have a couple of slides here with statistics on them. It says here, providing equal pay to women would have a dramatic impact on their families. The poverty rate for all working women would be cut in half, falling from 8% to 3.8%. The very high poverty rate for working single mothers would fall by nearly half, down to 14.5%. For the 15.3 million single women, divorced, widowed, separated, never married women living on their own, equal pay would mean a significant drop in the poverty rate to 4.4%. Approximately 25.8 million children would benefit from the increased earnings of their mothers if they received equal pay. The number of children with working mothers living in poverty would nearly be cut in half, down to 3.1 million. Women's just earnings are increasingly important to the economic stability of families. In the United States, half of the households with children under 18 have a single mother or a married mother who provides at least 40% of the couple's joint earnings. Many women without children, both single and married, work to support themselves and other family members. Therefore, persistent earning inequality for working women translate to lower pay, less family income, and more children and families living in poverty. The Catholic Church's traditional teaching affirms that wages must honor a person's dignity and the ability to contribute to the common good of society and family well-being. If the dignity of work is to be protected, then basic rights of workers must be respected, including the right to productive work, to decent and fair wages, to organizing and joining unions, to private property, and to economic initiative. A just wage not only provides for workers' financial well-being, but fosters their social, cultural, spiritual dimensions as individuals and members of society. Every worker has a right to a just wage according to the criterion of justice, which St. John the 23rd describes as a wage that gives the worker and a family standard of living in keeping with the dignity of the human person. St. John Paul II elaborated on the systematic implication of just wages, describing them as a whole concrete means of verifying the justice of the whole socioeconomic system. However, when a society fails in the task of ensuring workers are paid justly, questions arise as to the underlying assumptions of that system. As members of society, we are called to respond to the questions of wage and justice. We can act justly in our own lives as employers or workers. More importantly, we can stand in solidarity with our poor minimum wage workers. Ultimately, we can live in the hope that our society can become even more just and that there's a conversion of heart and mind so that people recognize the inherent dignity of all and work together for justice.
Thank you, Ginny and Imali. It's truly a privilege to be on the panel with these amazing women. And I'm going to shift gears a little bit, although I can't help but see some of the interrelationships between all of our topics. So I will be talking about the hashtag #MeToo movement and a little bit about some current events. The salience of the hashtag #MeToo movement since October of 2017 warrants its consideration in a conversation about women as the heartbeat of society. From Harvey Weinstein to Matt Lauer to Charlie Rose and even Brett Kavanaugh, the fall of powerful men, or lack thereof, has dominated headlines over the past year. Time magazine even named the person of the year as the silence breakers, or the women who shared stories of sexual assault and sexual harassment. It appears that we are in an era where justice for women, at least on the surface, is at the forefront. However, the dominant narrative of women triumphing over vilified men, perhaps best personified in the Wonder Woman image, is too simplistic. As society is confronted by the overwhelming pervasiveness of sexual assault and sexual harassment, with a 2018 survey showing that 6 in 10 women have been sexually harassed, made real in part by the hashtag #MeToo movement, many questions about justice arise. Questions such as, what does justice mean in the age of social media? How do we confront the ways that power and privilege make invisible the very cultures that disadvantage women? How can social change bring about just communities? These are big questions that I cannot fully answer. However, I believe that sociology, of course, and more broadly, a liberal arts education is well positioned to direct our gaze as we contemplate these issues. In 1959, C.W. Mills, a famous sociologist, wrote, "People do not usually define the troubles they endure in terms of historical change and institutional contradiction. They do not possess the quality of mind essential to grasp the interplay of individuals and society, of biography and history, of self and world." He goes on to argue that sociology does just that, brings together the intersection of history and biology, or sees personal problems as public issues. To challenge the dominant narrative, to more fully understand sexual assault and harassment, and to be agents of change in our society, we must consider the intersection of history and biography. To do this, we must situate the stories of individuals in the broader context of society. Our hashtag #MeToo movement has done just that. It's provided a catalyst to see personal problems as public issues. It has brought attention to this relationship, and in doing so, causes us to pause and consider the reality of justice in our society at the institutional, organizational, and individual level. Allow me to offer 4 lessons we can learn by examining the hashtag #MeToo movement at the intersection of history and biography. I believe it is important, especially for students, to critically reflect on the hashtag #MeToo movement in the context of justice as they consider owning or not owning the label of feminist, a label that carries much negative baggage and one that many young women and men are hesitant to claim. This is your issue, and your response, whether you take a feminist label or not, must be driven by your convictions about women, community, and justice. So let's start with history. And lesson number 1. This is not a new issue. Sexual harassment, women fighting to have a voice, and more broadly, the complexity of power in societies is not a new issue. Even the usage of a hashtag #MeToo is not new. The hashtag was started in 2006 by Tarana Burke. However, when celebrity Alyssa Milano reintroduced the hashtag in October of 2017, it garnered immense attention. Some of my colleagues could take you back to ancient Greece. I won't go back that far. Just 125 years ago, no country allowed women to vote. Women worked long and hard to change that. So lesson number 1, history shows us that change can happen. There was a time when women were fined for wearing slacks in the courtroom. Women could not get credit without a male to co-sign. In some states, women could not serve on juries. It was unthinkable for women to hold some jobs, such as news anchors or airline pilots. This is a reality that's unknown to many women today, yet a reality in which the dignity of human persons is violated through harassment and assault is one that too many still know. However, history also shows us that not as much has changed as we think it has, which brings me to lesson number 2. Change is not guaranteed to last. In October of 1991, the nation witnessed Anita Hill testify at the Senate Judiciary hearing for Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas. She was deemed at that hearing a little bit slutty and a little bit nutty. Images of her speaking to an all-white, all-male panel are iconic. However, the following year, 1992, was termed the Year of the Woman, as American voters elected more new women to Congress than in any previous decade. Here we are in 2018, and we're still questioning, are women really telling the truth? Lesson number 3, considering the larger social context does not negate the importance of the individual. If #MeToo has taught us anything, it is that personal stories matter. However, as C. Wright Mills contends, these personal stories bring about change as we move to understand them as public issues. Conversations that only focus on the actions of individuals are inadequate. Even arguments about organizational policy fall short of really addressing sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is not fixed with policy alone. In fact, there's evidence that policy intended to change cultures has further entrenched practices. Change requires a cultural shift. One of my favorite explanations of culture is this: humans are to culture as fish are to water. You're in it and you don't even realize it. This is the challenge of creating a cultural change. What the #MeToo movement and other social movements do is create ripples in our cultural water. However, they alone do not bring about immediate change. Informal culture is more difficult to change than organizational structure, but organizational structure is ineffective without cultural change. That change takes work, time, and often the sacrifice of individuals. The #MeToo movement must cause us to critically examine not only the cultures of our workplaces, but also larger notions of gender and power in society. Lesson number 4, my final lesson. If we are to understand the social context in which personal stories are told, we must acknowledge that privilege remains important in the conversation. Yes, the perpetrators of the movement possessed privilege, but what about the victims whose stories were told and those that were not? Several news stories have pointed out that part of the success of the #MeToo movement in this time and place lies in the believability of the women that were harassed. These stories note that the movement gained traction because white, beautiful women with prestige spoke out against a suitable, quote, male enemy. Consider the lack of mobilization that occurred when women began speaking out about other powerful figures, for example, Bill Cosby. Race and ethnicity, social class, and even beauty intersect to allow some to be heard more loudly than others, yet too little is said about privilege. So in conclusion, yay for the #MeToo movement in empowering women to share their stories, and Twitter for giving us a tool that speeds that process by which the movement can gain traction. But before we are too encouraged by the current climate, let's remember that the hashtag alone will not generate lasting change. Real cultural change requires perseverance. Think of the 100-year-long fight for women's rights to vote and commitment from us all. Whether we have a #MeToo moment or not, we can stand with those that have. We can challenge our culture by making visible the power structures that threaten justice. And I'll end with the words from Pascal. Justice and power must be brought together so that whatever is just may be powerful, and whatever is powerful may be just.
Well, I hope that you can start to see some connections between our presentations today. My name is Dr. Kelsey Squire, and I'm going to be speaking a little bit about women in the media. So today I'm interested in examining the representation of women in the media and the arts as an issue of social justice. My goal is to reflect a little bit on feminist research practices, but to consider how those practices might connect not only to other fields, but to our communities and even things like the media and popular culture. So first, I'm going to consider briefly what problems exist when we look at how and where women are represented, and then I want to consider how two practices, critical imagination and strategic contemplation, might help us to understand and act on issues of women and injustice. One of my own scholarly interests is in reception, which asks us to consider how readers or viewers react to things like books or movies. In her book, How to Suppress Women's Writing, Joanna Russ provides a rich, analytical, and actually sometimes very entertaining examination of the ways in which women's work in the arts has been dismissed throughout history. And so she has a list, and I have the cover of her book up here on the screen, and you can see that she lists all of the different reactions that people will have to try to dismiss women's writing in particular. So this is her list. One of the first reactions is to just say she didn't write it. She wrote it, but she shouldn't have because it was too political, sexual, masculine, or feminist. She wrote it, but look at what she wrote about: the bedroom, the kitchen, her family, other women. She wrote it, but she only wrote one of it. She wrote it, but she isn't really an artist, and it isn't really art. She wrote it, but she had help. And lastly, she wrote it, but she's an anomaly. While this list considers women writers, I think that many of these arguments can be seen in some fashion in other fields. Why aren't there more female scientists? They're not good at science. They had help. They're not interested in the right questions. Why aren't there more female CEOs? Women aren't leaders. They don't have the right skills, and they'd rather be with their families. For most people, it's easy to identify popular and successful female actresses, authors, and musicians, and other notable female figures. This ability might lead us to believe that parity has been achieved. In looking at data, however, there are several ways in which we can see women are lagging in representation in several fields. The group VITA, Women in the Literary Arts, hosts an annual count of the number of female-authored pieces in major periodicals. While some publications in 2018, like Granada and Poetry Magazine, had at least half of their pieces written by women, the New York Review of Books came in last, with 77% of its published pieces written by men. The Women's Media Center's study of the 2018 Oscar nominations also found that 77% of the non-acting nominations for fields associated with things like writing, editing, and directing went to men as well. In terms of scientific writing, the journal Nature published a 2013 study of over 5 million papers in science that were written between 2008 and 2012, and these were papers from all around the world. Less than 30% of the authors named on those publications were women. Many orchestras around the world have switched to blind auditions, with a performer sitting behind a screen. Having a blind audition increases a female performer's chance of advancing to the next round by 50%. And interestingly, this 30-50 split shows up again here. While as few as 5% of orchestra positions went to female performers in the 1970s, now it is up to 30%, but it still is not at parity. So one of the things that we might ask is, why is the representation of women in these fields important? And an underlying question might be here, haven't we moved sufficiently beyond gender in the 21st century that it shouldn't matter if things aren't 50-50? My research into women as storytellers reveals that to be silenced, to be unable to share one's story, is deeply dehumanizing. In We Should All Be Feminists, a book, but also a wonderful TED Talk, author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie reveals several mundane but routine experiences of being ignored or even dismissed because of her gender. From being denied the opportunity to serve as class monitor at 9 years old because she was a girl, to not being acknowledged in restaurants, Adichie writes that, quote, "Each time they ignore me, I feel invisible, I feel upset. I want to tell them that I'm just as human as a man, just as worthy of acknowledgement." For another perspective, long-distance swimmer Diana Nayed was the first confirmed person to swim from Cuba to Florida without a shark cage, and she did this at age 63. In a recent New York Times op-ed article, Nayed shared her experience of being repeatedly molested by one of her coaches growing up. And she reflects, for me, being silent was punishment equal to molestation. Nayed's piece reminds us that to feel pressure to be silent, to be unable to share one's story, was just as bad and just as painful as being physically assaulted. So what do we have to gain by women being represented by hearing stories of women? In feminist rhetorical practices, authors Jacqueline Jones and Geshe E. Kirsch suggest two concepts that can help us understand the importance of the representation of women: critical imagination and strategic contemplation. Reister and Kirsch are interested in how research in their field, and in this case, it was composition and rhetoric, might incorporate and reflect feminist practices. Critical imagination, the authors argue, is an inquiry tool, a mechanism for seeing the noticed and the unnoticed, rethinking what is there and what is not there, and speculating about what could be there instead. In considering my own field, this term of critical imagination reminds me of a pop culture tool for analyzing films called the Bechdel test. This process is named after Alison Bechdel, a cartoonist, who proposed a simple way of evaluating books, movies, and other narratives. And so she had 3 rules. Number 1, does it have 2 women who speak to each other? That's rule number 2. And number 3, do they speak about something other than a man or a relationship? Recent movies like Mission Impossible Fallout and Solo, a Star Wars story, have been reported to have failed this test. But other films like Black Panther and Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom pass. This doesn't mean that Mission Impossible and Solo, a Star Wars story are bad movies. I've seen them both, they're really entertaining. But from a perspective of critical imagination, watching a film with the Bechdel test in mind asks us to consider why women aren't even talking to each other in these films and what this means. Critical imagination asks us to first look at the world around us and the patterns that emerge, and then to consider alternatives that might exist to those patterns. As Reister and Kirsch suggest, critical imagination is not an endpoint to engaging with the representation of women. They advocate for strategic contemplation as a necessary correlative. As someone at a Dominican institution, this concept really appeals to me. It might be easy for us to think of contemplation as aimlessly thinking about something, but this isn't the case. Strategic contemplation asks us to connect our thoughts and deeds to our lives as researchers especially, and with those of others. Reister and Kirsch argue that part of strategic contemplation involves engaging in dialogue with female subjects, even if that's only imaginatively, to understand their words, their visions, their priorities, whether and perhaps especially if they differ from our own. A key part of this process involves listening, allowing female subjects to tell their stories. It also involves a consideration of our values and how they shape our identity as researchers and our research. How can we hold an ethos of humility, respect, and care in our research? What are the values that I hold as a researcher, and how are those reflected in my work? I hope that you can consider how to put critical imagination and strategic contemplation into action in some part of your life today, whether that is thinking about your lives at this university, as a community member, or even the hobbies that you enjoy. For critical imagination, take time to consider, what patterns do I see reflected about women in my field, in the community, or in the media? What tools and strategies might I use to see those patterns that aren't as apparent to me? For strategic contemplation, consider what women are involved in my field, my community, and my hobbies. How can I take an opportunity to listen to their experiences and their concerns? What values emerge from these conversations? And how can we put our contemplation into action? I hope that by engaging in acts of critical imagination and strategic contemplation, that we can better understand the lives of women, and that we can develop strategies for changing our fields, workplaces, and communities in light of those shared values.
Okay, so before Sister can be able to speak, we thought we would end our session by giving you at least 3 major quotations. One from Muhammad al-Jinnah, which says, "No nation can rise to the height of glory unless your women are side by side with you." And the other one is from Chinese author Mao Zedong, and it says that women hold up half the sky. And lastly, we are hoping, based on what we have shared with you, that you will agree with us by looking at the scripture which says, learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. And if we can be able to do all that, then we can be able to say that we are leading a just life. Thank you.